So last week we were going over grace, and we obviously spoke about one of the two main categories of grace. There's actual grace and sanctifying grace. We talked about actual grace last week predominantly, if you remember. And we remind ourselves that the necessity of free will cooperation with grace, that God cannot save us by force. God does not save us by force. God does not save us against our will. We have to freely cooperate in his plan in order to be saved. And so grace and free will work together to produce works. That's what it boils down to. I know I'm cooperating with God's grace if I see the works. If there are no works, then I'm not cooperating with God's grace, because God's actual grace is meant to assist me in activity, in doing something. That's the goal, is to help me to do things. And so that's how I know if I'm cooperating, is if there are works. And that's why James the Apostle in the New Testament says, faith without works is dead, because it means faith that is not cooperating with God's grace, therefore it is not growing. And so actual grace and sanctifying grace, remember, those are the two main categories. Actual grace is available to everybody, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The greatest sinners or the worst saints, God offers all of them actual grace every single day. Not everybody wants it. Not everybody cooperates with it. Not everybody is saved is what it boils down to, because not everybody wants to be saved. That's what we have to contend with. Not everybody goes to heaven because not everybody wants to go there. That's just a stone cold fact. And God does not save by force. So actual grace, the grace that God offers everybody every single day to give them that little shove to hopefully help them to draw closer to him, and in the end, to enter into a state of what we call sanctifying grace. That's the end goal of actual grace, to get us to sanctifying grace and to help us remain in it. Because again, the actions, the decisions are important. Sanctifying grace. Now, sanctifying grace is complete union with God on this earth, the closest we can get. The best example of sanctifying grace we find actually in the Old Testament, at the very beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve. You notice when they're created, number one is there's no fear of being in God's presence. But also Genesis tells us that Adam speaks to God as one man speaks to another. That this is how close they are. This is how understood God is to him, and how Adam is able to speak to God in response. They're like one person to another. That's the closest thing they can find to tell us how close they were to God. It tells us Adam and Eve walk with God in the garden. They're living in God's presence all the time, walking with God, being with God. They're not afraid. They're not embarrassed. Nothing. They're living in complete and total union with God. That's sanctifying grace. They're created in sanctifying grace for relationship with God. And God, again, though, does not force them to cooperate in that. He gives them an option. You can eat the fruit or don't. He tells you, I advise you not to eat the fruit. Don't eat it. It's bad. You regret it. We know how that ends. They eat the fruit, and they're cast out from the Garden of Eden. And then if you notice, as you read through the Old Testament, there's a dramatic shift in this relationship with God, that never again in the entire Old Testament is anyone permitted to look upon God face to face. Even we just heard the greatest prophet of the Old Testament, Elijah, can only see part of God's glory. Moses, who they say is the closest to God, still is only able to see part of God's glory, because God tells him, if anyone looks upon me, they shall die. This is how damaged human nature is from the fall. That it's incapable, even physically speaking, of being in a close relationship with God again. That's what happens when we lose sanctifying grace. And then that all begins to change when Christ comes into the world. Shortly before his passion, what does he tell Philip? Philip, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So he's saying, I can enable you once again to have the type of relationship that was had at the beginning, but even better, that I will be a part of your life even. So Christ enters into this world, and this is why he creates a church and sacraments, in order to offer us the opportunity once again to enter into that kind of relationship with God. That sanctifying grace is an absolute necessity to get to heaven. There's no way around it. And so actual grace comes along and helps push us, guide us, direct us in the right way. And once we get into sanctifying grace, first and foremost through the sacrament of baptism. Baptism has multiple goals, as we know. makes us adopted children of God. Pretty clear. Erase original sin. Well, why does it need to erase original sin? It needs to erase original sin so that way the sanctifying grace can once again inhabit that person's soul. That's one of the main goals of baptism, is to erase original sin. That way, sanctifying grace can be there and dwell there, and a person can dwell in that relationship with God. That's why we baptize children predominantly, because it offers them that opportunity from the very beginning of their lives to be open to the graces God wants to send them. But we also know that throughout our lives, as we grow, we do a lot of good things. We do a lot of dumb things. We make a lot of mistakes. I mean, I've made a few, I'll admit, maybe, okay, a lot. I've made a lot over my life. And there's a lot of things I wish I could go back and change, but you can't. You can't change the past. It's happened. And there's a lot of times deliberately not cooperating with God's grace, not doing what I'm supposed to do, even though I knew I should have done it. That's what that does, is that endangers that life of God in us. And eventually mortal sin, which is why they call it mortal, means it's deadly, kills that life of God. It deprives us of that sanctifying grace. That's why it's so serious. And so Christ, knowing how broken we are as human beings, how difficult it is in this world with these people and ourselves, how difficult it can be, what does he do? He creates another sacrament. He says, here's another sacrament, a medicinal sacrament, a remedy sacrament that will resurrect that life of God in you, that sanctifying grace, the sacrament of penance. That's why it exists. To forgive sins, sure, but the main goal of forgiving sins is what? To restore sanctifying grace in the soul. And that's why God made it. That's why I push everybody to it all the time, and nobody wants to hear it anymore. Oh, well. It's that important. There is no other avenue of obtaining sanctifying grace in this world outside of a direct miracle of God's grace than the sacrament of penance after baptism. That's why it's so important. Because once we're deprived of sanctifying grace, what happens? I'm now distanced from God. Like Adam and Eve, now outside of the Garden of Eden. To kind of put it in perspective, I guess, The other day I was out cleaning bits of burned off rubber off the quarter panels of my hot rod, and it brought to mind tires. Tires. We all have them on our cars, hopefully. And, they make a big difference when you're driving. Worn down tires do not work well. I think we've all done it before. We've run them to what we call, the wires start showing sometimes. We've all been in that situation where money was a little tight and we're trying to scrape by, or we've just decided to waste that money on other things, and now we have other problems. But tires are important because, as we always say, life is a journey. It's a road. And our journey of life is literally like Michigan roads, filled with potholes and closed downs and detours and roadkill and all these other things we run into out there on these roads. That's what life is exactly like. It's like peaks and valleys. There's high spots and low spots too. And the good Lord knows. So at baptism, he gives us that new set of tires and says, okay, go. Drive. You can make it so far if you're careful. If you ever notice, when you have good tires, you can avoid obstacles a lot more easily. If you see a danger, you can slam on the brakes and lock them up, and it'll stop a lot sooner. The worse the tires become, the harder it is to avoid the obstacles. And sometimes, unfortunately, we deliberately drive into things. We've all hit potholes just by the fact we're not paying attention. There's been those occasions where we maybe went off the shoulder of the road a little bit. It happens because we make mistakes, because we're humans. But every now and then we come to a hill in life that we have to climb, a peak that we have to crest. And we're sitting there at the bottom of that peak. And the good Lord, Jesus, comes along in his four-wheel drive truck, and he gives us a little shove. That's actual grace. It's this little push saying, now you need to cooperate with that push. I gave you a little shove to get you going, but you have to keep your foot on the gas to get to the top. Now, there's two things that can prevent us from making it to the top. The first one is I keep my foot on the brake. That is my free will. If I refuse to let off the brake, then that little shove of grace is not going to help me get to the top, is what it boils down to. I'm going to stay right where I was. And Jesus is not going to come and slam into me and just demolish my life. Again, he needs me to cooperate. Here's a little shove. There's one other thing that can hamper us. And that is when the tires we're trying to drive on are bald. Zero traction. It becomes next to impossible to make it to the top of that hill. And that's just a fact. There's no denying that that's the way it is. So our good Lord, after baptism, when we've messed that up, and at the end of the day, life just wears us down. I mean, there's no avoiding the fact life does wear us down. We're human beings. We get worn down. Our desire to do good wears down. Our wish of fulfilling God's will also wears down. Our patience, our virtues, the way we react with other people, and there's sometimes, dare I say it, stupidity. It wears us down. Just like the more you drive in that car, the more it wears the tires down. So it is with life and us and the desire to do good and the grace in us. It gets worn on. It gets pushed. It gets used up. And eventually we get to the point where there's very little traction left. So what does Jesus do in his goodness? He makes a tire shop. That's the sacrament of confession. That's the confessional. It's the tire shop for the soul. He says, right off to the side, pull off to the side. He says, I know what you're going through. I have the remedy for it. But notice again, he does not drag us into it. You can keep driving on the road on those crummy tires until something bad happens. You can do that. Or you can say, yes, I should get this taken care of before something bad, worse does happen. And he's waiting there for me, right there in the sacrament. And so if I have that traction and that little shove of God's grace, what happens is I crest the hill. I make it over the obstacle. I'm able to make it through that part of life that was difficult, that looked daunting and impossible at the beginning. I can make it because now I'm filled with the grace that enables me to keep on going. And there's a side effect to all that. There's one other thing we have to keep in mind, just like driving with those tires. There's other people that are at stake. If I'm driving on bad tires, there's the person in front of me. I can slam into them because I can no longer stop. I cannot avoid the obstacle. I've gone too long without God's grace that now it's starting to damage other people, but also the people behind me who are watching. They might be following me so closely that it's too late for them to swerve too. It's too late for them to stop too because they trusted me. They believed that I was leading them right. And now we're both in an accident because I chose to ignore the good Lord on the side of the road back there. So, that sanctifying grace is an absolute necessity. Christ offers it to us. He helps restore it when we've destroyed it, when it's been worn down by the things and the situations and the people and all these things we have to deal with. But again, my free will. I have to want it. We'll finish up with the sanctifying grace next week because there's a lot to deal with. But just one last thing for us to think about. God desires all souls to be saved. He desires that. He wants us to be saved. He does everything he can to enable us to achieve salvation. But I have to want it. I have to take him up on the offer. I have to respond to his call.